Pit Talk, brought to you by Shannons.
Cars are our passion. Building, restoring, or modifying. It's about making it our own. It's an obsession. Shannons know what it's worth. That's why the agreed value includes all your modifications. Get a quote online today.
This is the moment then that we've all been waiting for.
4 in a row, Max.
Here comes Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris.
They are playing hardball out there at the moment.
The pivotal moment of 2024.
Hello and welcome to Pit Talk, brought to you by Shannons. On today's episode, we're in Australian Grand Prix week and McLaren is tipped to be favourite at the start of this new season. And for our first episode of the season, we're joined by former Haas F1 team principal Guenther Steiner to get his take on the season to come and his new book, Unfiltered. My name's Michael Laminato, motorsport writer at Fox Sports Australia. It's great to have your company and the company of my co-host. His name's Matt Clayton. You can call the team Racing Bulls if you like, but for him it's always Minardi.
Michael, great to join you for another season. Very, very much looking forward to get stuck into the Australian Grand Prix, 5 days away?
Yeah, the clock is really ticking. It feels like it creeps up on us every year. It is going to be a big first round, not only because it's back in Australia, where personally I've always felt it should be. Sometimes I disregard the first two rounds in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. The time zone's terrible anyway. But we are back in Australia for the very first round of the season. And for the first time in a long time, it feels like we've got a genuine chance at breaking that streak of no Australians on the podium at the Australian Grand Prix. Potentially even a first winner, an Australian winner at the Australian Grand Prix, because McLaren, after pre-season testing, looked really competitive. That seems to be the vibe.
Yeah, look, I think so. They've got momentum from last year. I think that's probably a key thing. And I think an underrated part in this season of so much change elsewhere, they're one of only two teams with an unchanged driver lineup. I think when you've got stability there and continuity of results, you look at what they did in pre-season testing, they weren't hogging lap times or really headlining things, but you could see the inherent pace was there. The long run pace was good. It looked like it had a good one lap pace as well. So you mentioned that podium drought for Australians at Albert Park, and goodness knows we've come close enough so many times. But could this finally be the year? I think if we're looking at a favourite going into Melbourne, it's got to be McLaren, but I think it's what's behind them that's particularly intriguing, because I think it's a lot murkier. I think McLaren is pretty clearly a standout. What happens behind them, not so sure.
Just before we look at some of those other contenders, because there's some great stories in that front-running pack, not least Lewis Hamilton at Ferrari. We've got a teenager at Mercedes and Red Bull Racing maybe on the back foot only for 24 months after absolutely dominating the sport. But McLaren as a championship contender is really interesting, because it's almost easy to forget that they won the Constructors' title last year. They came from nowhere 2 years earlier. Even at the beginning of last year, looked sort of fourth best, thereabouts, waiting for these upgrades that did eventually change the complexion of their season. But we also saw in the second half of the year this battle between Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. And admittedly, it wasn't on the points table because Norris was quite a bit ahead of Piastri in the second half of the season by the end of the year. But we could see sometimes a little bit of a challenge for that balance of power inside the team, couldn't we? I think of Monza, where Oscar Piastri got ahead of Lando Norris at the start. Azerbaijan, when all the talk was about helping Lando Norris, it was him who led the flag, and there are other examples, of course. How ready do you feel McLaren is to challenge for the championship in that context?
Yeah, look, I don't know if you're ready until you're thrown into that situation to have to deal with it live, because last year you're fighting from a position of disadvantage. The fact they tripped each other up a couple of times, I mean, realistically, Charles Leclerc won Monza because of what happened with the McLaren drivers in the opening part of that race. But when you're doing it coming from a fair way back, I'm not sure it matters as much because the spotlight isn't as bright. You go into this season, points are reset. Everyone expects McLaren to be the team to beat, not chasing this Red Bull that's so far away like they were last year. So to me, that's the interesting part. If you've got a live championship with these two at the front rather than chasing a Verstappen or whoever it was, that's when management's going to have to really think on their feet here. How do you deal with this situation where you've got the homegrown talent like Norris, who's been in there the whole time, McLaren protege, rising to a point where he's a championship contender, and then you've got Piastri, who's coming through this side door and immediately proven that he can win races. It's a difficult thing to manage, and they don't have the experience of managing that for big prizes. So that's going to be super interesting, I think.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about, in the last 2 years, and especially in the last year, this development rate of Oscar Piastri, how it's almost race by race as much as it is in year on year. But I spoke to him during the off-season. He was talking about how much McLaren had to do the learning last year to be, as you said, as a front-running team. And like we've seen from Oscar as well, and Lando, because he only won his first Grand Prix last year, it's not until you're really in that position, and this goes for the team as well, that you understand those pressures. You can have all the processes you like. And McLaren has these papaya rules. I hope a phrase we don't hear this year. Not just because I don't like team orders, but come up with a better name for it.
Yeah, come on.
Please, come on, lift. They've got a big marketing department. They can do better. That's what's going to be interesting, is how they handle that. Because if we consider who they're up against, it's not just themselves. It's, well, where do we want to start? We could start at, let's start with Ferrari. Okay, a team that maybe traditionally hasn't posed the greatest strategic challenge to other teams.
No.
But is a team that has been getting better. Let's be fair. In the last 12 to 18 months, certainly under Fred Vassar's reign as team principal, the team's become much more competent, certainly much more competitive in the last season and 6 months in particular. And they've got this motivation of Lewis Hamilton. The story of the year, regardless of what happens. How do you think this relationship's going to start? Because it's really smiley at the moment. Anyone who's seen Lewis Hamilton recently, I can't remember the last time he looked this happy. Can't last, can it?
No, there is a honeymoon period with these things. You mentioned Ferrari improving strategically. It was from a fairly low base, like the basement of the bases. But it's so interesting to see. To me, the story of this season is not so much the intra-team dynamic with Piastri and Norris. Ferrari here, you've got Charles Leclerc, who's been the protege, and he's proven that he's probably the best one-lap driver in Formula One, and he's been a proven race winner now. He's a Ferrari lifer. And then Lewis Hamilton comes in at 40. This is the team he's always wanted to drive for. Everyone's happy. It's all fantastic. Which one of these two gets the ascendancy is such an interesting story because of the way it defines legacies for either. If you're Leclerc and you get to the end of the season, it's like, well, Lewis Hamilton came into my team and I saw him off. If you're Hamilton and you come into Leclerc's team and as an outsider into this Ferrari family, as a 40-year-old, and rekindle some of those past glories, it's such an interesting inflection point for the two of them. So to me, I think it's the off-track story of the season. But look, everyone's happy coming to Melbourne because no one's scored a point yet.
Yeah,
but wait till we get to Saturday afternoon after qualifying and somebody's aggrieved that they've been sent out at the wrong time or something. And yes, perhaps the smiles might be turned down a little bit.
Might be a bit harder for Lewis Hamilton to sound so positively philosophical after the Australian Grand Prix. Let's talk about Red Bull Racing because, well, no longer the reigning Constructors' Champion, but with the reigning Drivers' Champion in its ranks, Max Verstappen. Several key moments last year in which he was very unhappy with the state of the car and even the team, of course, if we go back around about 12 months ago. He's teaming up with Liam Lawson this year, a veteran of 11 Grand Prix starts. Can't call him a rookie, 11 is way too many. So they say. I think he's a rookie. I think we give him a little bit of slack.
I agree.
But there's a lot of pressure on this team, not only because of all those rumours about, well, Max Verstappen contract break clauses if the team underperforms, the unhappiness inside the team. They've already lost Adrian Newey. But this was meant to be the Red Bull era, wasn't it? 2 years ago, we forget, won every Grand Prix but one. We were all preparing for another 2 or 3 years of just sadness. But here we are, looking genuinely vulnerable, perhaps as the fourth fastest team.
It's incredible to think this time last year, Red Bull, Verstappen could have won 10 races in a row for the second time in a 21-race span. It's unbelievable. We came here last year thinking, will anyone beat this car this season after they'd just about swept the field the previous year? But to my mind, the Verstappen thing is a blessing and a curse for that team because I would suggest maybe that car hasn't been that fantastic for a couple of years, but he is so good at taking a really, really sharp instrument and say, make this car as difficult as you possibly can make it. If it's faster, I will extract the pace out of it. And it's not so much what Max does in it, it's what the guy in the other car doesn't do. And I think you saw last year, as that car got more and more difficult, Sergio Perez's form flatlined and then nosedived. And it cost them, I mean, didn't even finish in the top 2 in the Constructors, which is insane. So to my mind, it's not so much what Verstappen does with this car, it's what can Liam Lawson do with this car as a baseline. Because if he's struggling, maybe not to the extent as Perez was, like you said, he's done 11 races. So there's a lot of question marks still that he can handle this. He's the best option they had at the time to put in that car. They probably should have had Carlos Sainz, but that's another story. But he's the best option for now. But it's his baseline to me that dictates whether Red Bull can fight with McLaren and with Mercedes at the front and possibly with Red Bull. I mean, we have to see, but there's a lot of questions for Lawson for me, and to me that determines where Red Bull season goes. Yeah,
and whether or not points scored in the Constructors' Championship influences contractual decisions, well, that could be really potentially quite costly for Red Bull Racing. Yep. Let's talk briefly about Mercedes before, of course, we talk about Jack Doohan, the other Australian, making, well, not his debut in Australia, his Australian debut, we can call it that. Yes. Teenager at Mercedes has replaced Lewis Hamilton. Outbound is a 40-year-old, incoming is an 18-year-old. He's though regarded as potentially the next great thing. I know a lot of teams think that their next drivers are the next great thing, but the hype around him is real. Has been super fast-tracked through the junior Formula A to get to Formula 1, skipped Formula 3 entirely. Didn't even have a full season of F2 under his belt when he was signed. In fact, he skipped the last couple of races as well, so didn't even have the full season under his belt. He's up against George Russell, alongside George Russell, who's established now, and I feel like towards the end of last year we got a sense that he can be that real title contender. He's got a little bit more of an edge about him now, but it's real intrigue because I get the sense that they didn't think there was going to be anything on the line this season, but pre-season testing kind of suggested there might be some regular wins here.
Yeah, look, I think with an asterisk, there's two things for me. You mentioned very fast and Antonelli in the same sentence. That's something we're going to say a lot.
Yes.
I also think he might hit a lot of stationary objects, Michael, because particularly a track like Albert Park for your first ever Formula One Grand Prix, it is a really difficult street circuit. Super quick, walls are super close. If I was putting money on who might be first in the fence over the course of the weekend, it'd be fairly strong towards Antonelli, I think. So I don't think he's going to lack for speed. We saw what he did in that FP1 session at Monza last year, where he was incredibly rapid for one lap and then hit the fence on the second one. So look, I think he's going to be super quick. You mentioned Russell being a team leader. I think that's something he's really grown into. It seems to suit him well. To my mind, the asterisk on pre-season testing, Bahrain was randomly very cool. And we saw last year that Mercedes were very, very good when it was cold. You think Las Vegas, they looked like they should have won the Constructors' Championship last year. They were unbelievable in that race. It was freezing cold. And so anyone that's been in Melbourne for the past week, it is roasting for early March here in Melbourne. And I know the forecast is tempering down a little bit for the weekend, but to me, that's the question mark. If that trait in Mercedes' car is awesome in cold conditions, a bit, maybe not so much in the warm weather, that could bring that optimism back a little bit, I think.
Before we move on, we've got to talk about Jack Doohan, of course, making his full season debut, let's call it, maybe with an asterisk, at Alpine this weekend in Melbourne. I say with an asterisk because really the story around him isn't that he's embarking on this first full-time season, and not even that he's the son of a five-time 500cc motorcycle champion. I guess he's probably happy he's shaken that tag. He's there on his own right. But the rumour is actually that he's only got a few races, perhaps as few as a handful of races, to prove himself. That takes him to the end of April, before the team considers putting reserve driver Franco Colapinto in the car. You'll remember Colapinto last year made his debut at Williams just after the mid-season break, replacing Logan Sargent there, and scored points. Did something that Sargent wasn't able to do all season. Was really impressive. If to take back on that phrase, he's fast but probably crash prone. There were quite a few crashes towards the end of last season, but the speed's clearly there. There's a lot of pressure on Doohan. The team doesn't really want to say anything. And I mean that they're not even pretending that's not the case. They're really trying to say as little as possible about this situation. This is the worst way to make your homecoming, surely.
It's a super tough gig because it feels that there's only one outcome here. It feels that we're all telling variations of the same story. And both of us have written basically the same story for various people over the past week. But it's incredibly harsh on someone who has come through the Alpine Academy. It feels like he may not get a chance to prove himself, and it may not even matter what he does in these first few races, because you look at what Alpine's done here. They've hired someone that possibly is as quick. I think Doohan had a better junior career coming into Formula One than Colapinto did. But, you know, I likened it this morning to imagine having you work all your life to get your dream job, and then the team immediately hires someone who's just as qualified as you and also has a very large sack of money that they can bring from sponsors, and just sit over there and, oh no, you're fine, just carry on. So a huge amount of pressure. I think it would probably be worse for Jack if this was his actual F1 debut. The fact he got to debut at Abu Dhabi last year, sort of in the anonymity of just driving around in the midfield, is good from a procedural point of view. But it's such a tough gig, and I hope that, look, he's a pretty switched on, very hard-working, determined young guy, has got there on merit. Let's just hope he gets a chance to prove himself before something else happens. Yeah,
it feels like the power's probably still in his hands. I mean, at the end of the day, incumbency is so powerful.
Is everything, absolutely.
He's the one in the car getting the results, so hopefully a good debut this weekend in Australia, and the next couple of races will be enough to get him, well, I've got to hope at least until the end of the season. Because I'm confident he could have an established career from there. Will be interesting to see. That's this weekend at the Australian Grand Prix. But in the lead up to this weekend's race, we caught up with Guenther Steiner, the former Haas team boss. I mean, you know who he is. You're listening to this podcast, you're watching, you know who Guenther Steiner is. He's written his second book, believe it or not. It's called Unfiltered. In fact, he's taking it on a speaking tour called Unfiltered Live, tickets which you can still get for Newcastle, Melbourne, Gold Coast and Brisbane. But we had a chat about his expectations for the season to come, also his experience of moving out of the F1 paddock and the pressures of always being in Formula One, and his expectations again for the season. And of course, that swearing ban comes up, believe it or not. So let's get into that. Guenther, it's good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I wanted to start, of course, we're leading up to the Australian Grand Prix. Everyone's excited for Formula One to return, and certainly here everyone's excited for Australia to be the first race again. But tell me what it's like to be running a team at this time of year. Is it excitement? Is it nervousness seeing where teams are going to stack up? Or is it all actually just about bracing for the 24-hour flight down to Melbourne?
It's all of it, what you just said, So, no. The biggest thing is the first race in the year. Obviously, the testing was last week in Bahrain, so people know roughly where they are. But coming to the first race is always the hopes are high. You're full of energy because you haven't been racing for a while, and you just look forward to go to the first race. And this year, being Australia again, the first race. It's quite good because people like that always. As you said, it's a long flight. So, it's good to come here. If you think most of the teams are from the UK, so the weather is normally a lot better here than over there. So, it's people love to come here.
No, we're very happy, Guenther, that it is back in its rightful place on the Formula One calendar, as we like to call it. But you mentioned pre-season testing there, and on that Australian theme, it does very much look like McLaren is going to start the season as favourite, which, it means both Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri could very well be title contenders. We know that they're up against some very big recent title winners, Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Red Bull, Mercedes. But in your view, how do you think Lando, and more particularly for our audience, Oscar, are going to stand up under the pressure of that possible first genuine title fight this season?
I think you're right. McLaren is the favourite. After Bahrain, it is, everybody's in the opinion is that they will be the team to beat this year. I think they will be okay because they got a lot of it last year. When middle in the season, all of a sudden they started to win races, and not only by default, but by actually being the best team on the grid. And out of that, they learned, and they are a lot better prepared this year to go for both world championships, not only one. Only one like last year. So I think they go in there ready and well prepared, mentally as an organization. The McLaren know now that they are the favorite, that they need to deliver. So I think they will be pretty happy to go in there with that attitude.
It's an incredibly even driver lineup as well. We saw that towards the second half of last year for a time. So, you've obviously had the team principals hat on yourself. How do you think a team like that is set up to handle a potential rivalry between two drivers, neither of whom have won a world championship? It's been a long time since McLaren won a drivers' world championship. Do you think that's going to be a narrative that we see play out within that team this year?
I think they're well prepared, and what I think they will do, they will be clear. Don't run into each other, but let's go, let's race. And then at some stage in the season, which normally I think it will be after the summer break, they will say whoever is in a better position, let's try to win the World Championship if anybody else can contend for it. Obviously, if it is just the two of them, I think then they let them race it to the end, So, but they are both drivers with a good head on their shoulders. So I think they've got, as you said, a very strong driver lineup, but also very mature in that sense driver lineup.
Guenther, you're a man who's got, I suppose, a couple of catchphrases after your decade in Formula One. Where did you rank the phrase papaya rules in the list of phrases you've heard in F1?
A lot of bullshit, huh?
You said it, we thought it.
Exactly, because I never found out what it is, and I asked Zach directly, what is it? And, it's our rules, yeah, you know what it was. A lot of BS, yeah.
Look, I want to change tack a little bit because the other really big story of this year is, of course, going to be Lewis Hamilton. Well, he has joined Ferrari now, and there's been a lot made about the transition he's going to have to undergo to become a Ferrari driver after so many years at Mercedes, and maybe more to the point, so many years with British teams. Now, you know Ferrari quite well through the partnership it had with Haas. How do you think that's going to go? And do you think that, I suppose, cultural element is a little bit overplayed when we're talking about Lewis Hamilton adjusting to life in Maranello?
I don't think so. I think you have to adjust because Ferrari will not adjust to you. Ferrari had a lot of big drivers, and the team culture never changed, I would say. But I think Lewis is smart enough to know that, and he will try to adjust to the culture. Obviously not always the easiest thing to do, especially if you think that Charles Leclerc speaks fluently Italian, is there a long time, grew up in that environment. So he needs to put some work in. But, Lewis knows that, and he just needs to work at it. But I'm sure he's not going to try to change the culture there to his what he's used to, because that's not going to happen.
You've been in not just Formula One for a while, but you've got a big motorsport background, obviously having started in rallying. The story with Lewis and Ferrari as a 7-time champion meeting the most successful team in Formula One history. If you were to win the title this year or in the next couple of years with Ferrari, where do you think that would rank in terms of motorsport significance?
Very high. I mean, going in there, coming from a 7-time world champion, and then if he wins at winning 8 world championships, which is a record, nobody else has done that. I think that would go into history. But also Ferrari hasn't won a world championship as a team in a long time. So just winning it again would in the Ferrari and in Italy would put him at a complete different level.
Now, I want to get you to put your, I suppose, man manager hat on, for want of a better phrase. It is an element of being a team principal. How do you think Charles Leclerc, who was previously Ferrari's golden child, the future of the team, will be handling being really so comprehensively overshadowed by Lewis Hamilton's arrival? I mean, we've already talked quite a lot about Lewis. Everyone's talking about Lewis. No one's talking about the guy that finished last year really strongly. What would you have to do to make sure he's not feeling like he's left out of the situation?
No, I think Charles knows that he's the long future for Ferrari because he's so much younger. He has got a long future there. And I think for Charles an opportunity, because being in a team with a 7-time world champion is always good. You can learn something from him, because winning a championship is not only being fast in a race car, it's also being smart and doing a very good job in a long race. So I think Charles will take it. I try to learn as much as possible for the time Lewis is there. Short term, obviously, Lewis took over the headlines. But Lewis hasn't won anything for Ferrari yet, while Charles has won races for them. So I don't think he's downbeat about it. I mean, he knows that Lewis is a big name, won 7 championships, and that the headlight is on him now. But if Charles then beats him, for example, that's even better for Charles. So I think he just will take a little bit of time, and then he can show what he can do. But I don't think it bumps him out.
No, it's a fascinating story, that one, no matter which of those two extremes plays out, as you said. But let's switch to, we were talking about Australian drivers before. Let's talk about the one who's not on the grid this year, with Daniel Ricciardo being out of the sport for good this time, you would think. And I wanted to ask you, what's the adjustment like from being right in the thick of F1, like you were and like Daniel was, to being an outsider? And I'm using air quotes here. You're not in the cut and thrust of the day-to-day. How is it for you? Because we talked about you being busy, but it's a different sort of busy and a different sort of pressure, I guess.
Yeah, no, I adapted very good. I like what I'm doing. As you said, I went out from one seat into the next seat, so I had no time in between to even think about it. It wasn't my plan to do this, what I did last year, all the work I did. So, but I enjoying it. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it. And it keeps you around in Formula One. But everybody's different, and Danny, after he left last year, I don't think he came to a race yet. I don't know if he's coming to Melbourne or not to the race, but everybody's different. And if he wants to take some time off, because that was my initial plan, I take some time off just to do a little bit what I wanted to do, and then people asked me to do things, and I did them, and I enjoyed them. But as you say, it's a different pressure. Obviously, it's not the high pressure like when you go out qualifying or racing, but it's still a pressure. But it's good to be around in the paddock and just not have to go to all the races. You can go where you want to go. You can decide yourself.
Of course, the other thing for you now is you don't get that competitive time every 1 or 2 weeks, depending on their calendar. You don't get that competitive itch to scratch now. So how have you replaced that adrenaline side? Because obviously, everything's so busy as a team principal. There is a race every week or 2 weeks throughout the season where you get to see where you stack up. So how do you personally scratch that competitive itch now that you're not involved on the inside?
I'm pretty fine with that, not having that adrenaline. And no, it's nice. The biggest thing is on a race weekend when the cars go out for qualifying. That's the only a few minutes you think, oh, that would be cool. But then it's just like you watch what other people are doing. It's nice to be the spectator sometimes.
Well, you've spent, and there's an element you touched on in your book as well that I sort of thought was interesting. The first couple of chapters, your latest book, of course, Unfiltered, talking about setting up the Haas team, which was more than a decade ago now. You were doing that preparatory work, and you were talking about how different Formula One was then compared to now. You've seen it in its current super popular era, where everyone wants to talk about Formula One, races are selling out regularly, all that kind of thing. But also in its decidedly less culturally relevant, very much less popular era a decade or so ago. I'm interested in your perception of how that's evolved from inside the sport. Obviously, you were there for that full decade, and also how important the likes of big characters are to the sport. We were talking about Daniel. He was obviously one of them. You've obviously made a massive name for yourself as someone who transcends the sport, for want of a better phrase. How important is it, or have those characters been, to Formula One becoming the sport we know today?
I think they were an element in it, but I think the biggest thing was that the sport was brought to more people, obviously through Drive to Survive in the pandemic, when Formula One was the first sport again going live again. People was watching it. So as you said, the Formula One has changed quite a bit from 10, 15 years ago to what it is now. But internally, it's just, I think it made it better. It's better organized, better structures. The team are normally financially a lot better off now than they were 10 years ago. 10 years ago, very few race teams made money. Now, I think that if they are not profitable, they break even, most of them. And what that does, it gives security to the people which work there, that they will have a job in the foreseeable future, which is always good if people have got security, job security. So it has changed, but it was a lot of elements coming together to make it what it is now.
And it's amazing what it has become. I mean, I think if we'd spoken to you 8 years ago, you wouldn't have been thinking, oh, I've written 2 books by now, and you've got this life that you have these days. But I did want to ask you about that, because you may remember, Guenther, last year we were doing something at the Australian Grand Prix for one of the corporates, and you were just being hounded by everybody so much before we started that I actually found you hiding in a bathroom. So that was something that you probably wouldn't imagine would have been life about 8 or 10 years ago. But do you ever look at this sometimes? And I know you don't watch Drive to Survive. That's one of your things that you've always said, but you never could have believed that life would have turned out like this with the way things have gone over the past 10 years, could you?
No, absolutely, and I think nobody could plan something like this. This is things just happening, You're just a passenger on these things, So, and they come along, and that, as you said, I would have never thought to write 1 book, never mind 2, So, and even selling them, but maybe writing them, but not selling them, Anybody wanting to read them, So, no, it's very, as you said, it came all by surprise,
I want to ask, and I know you've been getting a lot of questions about this, can't imagine why, but the FIA is contemplating a swearing ban in Formula One. Now, I was reading your book and I was interested to hear that you already live under a bit of a swearing ban at home. I can't imagine how that works out for you. So is there a home Guenther and an at work Guenther, and ironically the one at work is swearing more? How's that happening?
Absolutely. That is happening, So, but I think what you see there, it's under, when it's under pressure, just the emotions get hold of you, and you do things which you normally don't do. But no, it's 2 different ones. You're absolutely right with that one.
Do you think they're going to be able to pull off this swearing ban this year?
I mean, they pulled it off in the end. Who wants to spend this amounts of money, just by but it's. I hope it doesn't take out, of the emotions what the driver have got, and controlling it too much, because it's. I mean, is it good if somebody swears? No, but is it this bad as it is made out of to be? No, as well, in my opinion. It's a sport lives from emotions. People want to see emotions, want to see characters, and if there is no emotions in it, we can have machines going around the racetrack.
And certainly, we don't want that. Guenther, it's been a pleasure. If anyone wants to catch you, there's still tickets left to Unfiltered Live, and the shows coming up are in Newcastle, Melbourne, the Gold Coast, and Brisbane. And of course, you can buy the book Unfiltered from all good retailers. One question before you go. You mentioned when you got that famous call from Gene, you were buying some ham. What was the ham, and did you buy it in the end, or did you go home empty-handed?
No, I bought some, and I went home and had dinner.
Well, thank you, Guenther. Enjoy your trip down to Australia, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, guys.
That was former Haas F1 team boss, Guenther Steiner, of course. And again, it's Unfiltered Live is his book tour, speaking tour. It's hard to believe. Only a few years ago he'd said that. That's what he's up to these days. It's Newcastle, Melbourne, Gold Coast and Brisbane. You can still get some tickets. There are only a few available. So if you want to go and see him, I would advise you get online and get those tickets now. But Matt, let's change things up a little bit. So I'm interested in playing a new game. It's a new season of the podcast.
What have you got for me?
Interested versus expert is what I'm going to call it.
Okay.
Now, we both know a lot about motorsport. F1 obviously is the main situation here on Pit Talk, but we do love our Supercars and MotoGP. But maybe the game here is to guess who's interested and who's the expert. I think the expert's probably going to be answering questions at this point.
Right.
We could do it the other way around, but it's probably a little bit less good.
Well, given I'm interested rather than the expert, shall we start off with some Supercars perhaps?
Okay.
And we're one round into the season. We already have a driver change.
Yeah, silly season never stops, does it, regardless of what sport you're involved in. It's Aaron Love has left the Blanchard Racing team. According to them, on his terms, he's decided to leave after 1 round and 3 races. He's been replaced by Aaron Cameron. This has been building up for a little while. His debut season last season, this is almost the theme of the podcast, isn't it? Very quick, but sometimes hits stuff.
Right. What a motto.
Yeah, maybe that could be the motto of the show. Got to hit some things before the show's finished. Unfortunately, the last thing he hit was his teammate, James Courtney, in warm-up for qualifying. You might remember this in Sydney for round 1, of course, at Sydney Motorsport Park. Both warming up for qualifying. James Courtney attempted to go around him. He's doing the weaving your tyres thing and they make contact. And that's not great. It's not a great situation to be in. And this is off the back again of a season last year where he showed a lot of speed promise. I mean, that's sort of been even his junior career leading up to the Supercars suggested there was this great speed. Just couldn't really convert that to that kind of consistency. And the team's decided, particularly after that incident, he's had enough. It's a bit unfair on him as well. It felt like this season got off the wrong foot in testing, had a brake failure and crashed and hit something, and that wasn't his fault. But sometimes things just don't go your way. And this is one of those things that hasn't gone his way. If you think from the team's perspective, the positive element here, I guess, is that you know James Courtney is retiring at the end of the year, and this means at least if you get someone in the car, in this case Aaron Cameron, you're not going into next season with an all-new driver lineup.
Correct.
And that's usually really quite important for a motorsport team, particularly one like BRT, which is trying to move up the grid. You want a little bit of consistency in the engineering through the drivers. So Aaron Cameron, we know he's quick, karting champion, S5000 multiple champion, Super 2 race winner, and runner-up in Super 2 as well, and was co-driving last year with Aaron Love at Bathurst and Sandown. So he knows the team, he knows the sport, deserves to be there. He's got the background to prove that he deserves to be there. So an astute change, but after 1 round it is a little bit rough, isn't it? I guess you might be looking at Albert Park and going, boy, the barriers are pretty close there.
They are a little bit. No truth to the rumour you're going to change your name to Aaron just to be the next guy on the list, is there? Or?
Well, I mean, look, if this doesn't work out, maybe I could drive. I drive pretty quick. No speeding tickets.
Yeah, so I've heard. Let's go back to Sydney. First round, just absolutely dominated by Cam Waters. 3 poles, 3 wins, 3 fastest laps, 3 very different races.
Yeah.
In that one in the wet dry, one a close race, absolutely dominated a race. Is this, like, he's been this nearly man. He's been, top 6 in the championship, I think 5 straight years, or maybe it's top 5 in 6 years, I forget. But he's been right up there for so long. So is this the year that he can turn that into something bigger, do you think?
It definitely feels promising because, like you said, it's the 3 different races element. I know we talk a lot about, well, this was 1 round and it was only 1 circuit, probably the most extreme tyre circuit we have on the Supercars calendar. It's a very particular track if you compare it to others. Albert Park's also another very particular track. But, yeah, like you say, in the cold, in the hot, in the day, in the night time, challenged by Triple Eight, not challenged by Triple Eight. Different strategies as well, particularly in that night race when it was close.
Well, a bit wet dry in that last one too.
Exactly. Nothing fazed him or the Tickford team. A team, we've got to remember, only a couple of years ago decided they've got to reduce back down to 2 cars so they could focus more on getting the most out of the package they had. This was, I know it's like, it is only 1 round and everyone's like, wow, 1 round. All those caveats we've just mentioned, but it was absolute. That was the word used. It was absolute domination, maximum points. I think what's really interesting for me, and there's the context here of in Gen 3, Ford's felt a little bit down and out and Chevrolet seemed to have things all their own way. was it Ford did really well this weekend as well? And I think that's what backs it up a little bit. Triple Eight was really the only GM representative in the top 5, certainly in the top 10 generally, all weekend. And also, that means if you're a General Motors fan, well, Triple Eight's switching next year, and that makes you a little bit worried. But for example, in the top 5 qualifying results over the course of the 3 races was 10-5 to Ford. Likewise, in the extended race results, 10 top 5 finishes to Ford over the course of the weekend to just 5 for General Motors. General Motors is still overrepresented on the grid as well. So this is punching way above Ford's weight in this regard. And what I really think is interesting to talk about that, if we take Triple Eight out of the equation, Waters' average pole margin over the course of the weekend was more than 0.6 of a second over the next GM team. It's huge. And so it really relies on, I mean, Triple Eight at the moment seems like the only competitor. We can talk about Walkinshaw and Andretti United with sort of thereabouts, and they are a 4 team. So on the basis of one round, you say, well, maybe the ceilings are a little bit higher. We don't know. We've got to see a few more tracks. But I mean, if you're a Cam Waters fan, I don't want to say you've been long suffering, but he's been close several times and hasn't managed to get it done. You must be allowing yourself to feel pretty good.
Last one on my interested but not expert list for you. You mentioned Triple Eight before. We're going to a racetrack where they were particularly good last year. 3 wins of the 4 between their 2 drivers. Is this what they need right now to perhaps get on par with Ford, as you were saying, or is last year's result a little bit irrelevant based on what we saw in Sydney?
It's a little bit hard to say because the Australian Grand Prix format is so random, really, in the context of any motorsport, really, but even the Supercars, 4 races grouped in a funny way, and you don't get a lot of setup time, which could be the really important element. It's all got to be done on Thursday pretty much, and then you're guessing between live sessions. So it's really quite fast-paced despite being a 4-day event.
And no pit stops.
Exactly. So completely different format of racing, going to have different weather, all that kind of stuff, super fastest track on the calendar, all that kind of stuff. But Triple Eight is that team that should be there pretty much everywhere. They, like you said, did so well last year. Also missed out on the perfect podium run by only one race. 7 podiums from 8 attempts essentially last year. Team manager Mark Dutton used the word must. I think must bounce back at the Australian Grand Prix. Obviously not from a points perspective because the season is long, but it is just that kind of dire picture that's been painted otherwise. That if Waters wins all 4 races, we're probably going to be having really quite a different, another different conversation after this about, well, this has all gone fairly in one direction. So it's going to be a really fascinating weekend. Do you want to talk about MotoGP?
Are we switching hats here, are we?
I'm highly interested.
You're highly interested?
Highly interested.
I'm here to help, Michael.
When's Marc Marquez going to win the title this year? Because remarkable scene.
Has he not already won it? No, I mean, look, I think this was the fear, I guess, use fear in inverted commas. You put the best rider on the best bike and expecting other outcomes, particularly early in the season, is probably wishful thinking. I think there is a little caveat with what he did in Thailand. They had tested there for 2 days previously, a fortnight earlier, and he was unbelievably strong. Like, waited until the last 15 minutes of the second day and said, how about this for a qualifying lap then? And everyone went, oh boy. So what he did in Buriram was not a massive surprise. So is he the World Championship favourite? Fantastic bike. We know how good Mark is. And he's in this sort of, last part of his career now. He's the 2nd oldest rider in MotoGP. It's one of those things that snuck up on us a little bit because he still looks like he's 23. 32 now. And the way he won in Buriram, I look at the Grand Prix where he cleared off at the front and then realised, oh, my tyre pressures are a bit low. I might just pull the handbrake on, relatively speaking here, sit behind my brother on the same bike until I've done the minimum 60% race distance with the tyre pressure, and then just breeze past him and gap him by 1.3 seconds in one lap. It was just an absolute demonstration of the margin that he had. Now, good at this track. He's won there several times before. A lot of data from pre-season testing. There are some variables coming up, but it's hard to see how he's not the strongest of those Ducatis, at least for this first part of the season. But I think the biggest challenge is still within his same garage. Well,
so this is the question, right? Because, and you mentioned it there, it's the next couple of races feel like we're in the Marquez universe, right? I mean, so we've got Argentina this weekend. We've got a lot of motorsport this weekend.
Sure do.
Sports. You're going to need to use your recording devices and so on. And then COTA, the Circuit of the Americas. Is there any point, even if you're Pecco Bagnaia turning up to these races, or is it all really about looking at, there's Qatar after that, and then the return to Europe for if anyone's going to challenge him?
I think Bagnaia could not have had a worse weekend in terms of just, banana skins that he tripped over pretty much in Thailand, because he had a difficult pre-season test, didn't get a race simulation in. got to Thailand, had to go through Q1 because there was an erroneous yellow flag in that last practice session. He then got balked by Franco Morbidelli, which got Morbidelli a grid penalty. Had to fight his way through Q1. He was constantly fighting with an arm behind his back all weekend. Never really looked like he was going to challenge for a win, but more or less had their measure of what was behind. And Pecco's one of these guys that he can't just jump on and be volcanic fast like Mark can. He's one of these guys, he's a slow build, slow burn. And when he can run a weekend on those terms, we saw it last year, he won 11 of 20 Grand Prix, but it wasn't so much what he did on Sunday, it was what he was doing on Friday. He's this methodical, slow burn rider that when he gets everything right, he was pretty much unbeatable last year on a Sunday. So I can't imagine a more problematic build-up than he had in Thailand. I think the races coming forward should be smoother than this. We'll see the gap reduce. Whether it reduces to a point where we can flip them, I don't know, but I think it's going to be far more competitive once we get to Argentina.
It's still incredible to me he won 11 Grand Prix last year.
And didn't win the title. Well, yeah, it was a championship he lost, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, yes, but ridiculous, really. And we've got to talk about Jack Miller. You know, maybe 6-8 months ago, we were thinking maybe he wasn't going to be in with the ride. And he's rocked up at Pramac now in the Yamaha stable and did, well, extremely well. Very impressive debut to him, and suddenly it looks like a new lease on life for him.
Fastest ever lap by a Yamaha of Buriram in 6 visits by MotoGP there. He'd ridden the bike for 2 tests. So I think this is consistent with what Jack does though, because you look at where he's been previously. When he was at Pramac Ducati, he was on pole in his second race in Argentina, which is an absolutely wild lap where the track was still half wet. He won 2 of his first 5 races when he went to Ducati's factory team in 21. His best results at KTM were in the 4th Grand Prix of that year at Jerez. Finished on the podium in the sprint and the Grand Prix. And I think Jack's one of these guys, he's so naturally talented that he hits the ceiling really, really quickly. There's that and the ability to just get on the thing and wring its neck. I sometimes wonder with Jack whether he hits his head on that ceiling a little bit early, and so the rate of development is very rapid and then it flattens out. The key thing for me is he's on a 1-year contract with Pramac. His teammate Miguel Oliveira's got 2, but I think Jack is willing to take the bike to places maybe Yamaha hasn't seen it for the past few years because they've only had 2 riders. And Fabio Quartararo is a fantastic rider. Alex Rins has been injured for the best part of 18 months. So I'm not sure they know where that bike is. Jack's taking it to places, 4th on the grid in qualifying at Buriram. Unbelievable qualifying performance. And Fabio Quartararo said afterwards, Jack disconnected his brain in Q2, which was said in Fabio's accent. It's better than the way I just said it. But it's so true in that Jack's willing to put it all on the line. So I wasn't surprised that he started quickly with Yamaha. I was surprised that it was so good. Look, the race weekend crashed from a good position in the sprint and then had the bizarre Grand Prix where a bolt came out of the fairing and he was holding it together on the straights with his forearms on the tank and managed to burn them because it was so hot. So a weird weekend of results, but I think the pace and the promise is really good there, and a couple of good tracks for him coming up too.
Yeah, that's such a MotoGP thing, burning your forearms, holding your bike together.
It'll be fine.
It's an extreme sport. It's remarkable. Is. And he'll be declared fit, don't worry, for the next race. That's your wrap-up, I guess, of those 2 sports so far. Because, as I said, Argentine Grand Prix this weekend for MotoGP, the Melbourne Super Sprint for Supercars, which also happens to be in the same location as the Australian Grand Prix. But just before we leave the last couple of weeks behind, by Shannons, we've got, of course, the Overtake of the month. Now, we're going to look back, of course, we've only had 2 rounds of anything so far, so the choices are relatively limited. But I think we've got some good ones. I'll kick things off. And for me, the Overtake, actually, it's sort of the opposite. It's an allowance of an overtake. It's a redress is what it is. I'm picking Cam Waters allowing Brock Feeney back through into the lead in the closing stages of the Saturday night race in Sydney, because he'd punted him off the road. This was a battle for the lead, really fraught. It was just a one-on-one. By punting him off the road, of course, Will Brown caught up. Had to redress to have another crack at him. And, of course, he eventually won this race by the closest margin in 50 years or something like that. And did it so expertly by keeping Will Brown behind him, because Brown did have the run, allowed Brock through. Even Will sort of had to begrudgingly go, oh, look, I didn't like it, but credit to him. So it's not quite, it is an overtake, but it's not the guy who did the overtake that's getting the award. It's the guy who let him be overtaken.
But it's also the quick thinking under pressure like that with so much on the line when you're being ganged up on 2 against 1. I think that was absolutely a great choice.
Yes, and it goes to that great weekend Waters had as well.
Yeah,
managed that. The management was there every facet.
I'll go 2 wheels with the very first lap of the sprint in the Thailand MotoGP. Iogura on an Aprilia on his MotoGP debut qualifies 5th Unbelievable performance. Best qualifying by a rookie in their very first MotoGP race since Fabio Quartararo in 2019.
Yeah.
Reasonable position to start. And he said afterwards, he got to turn one, couldn't believe how hard Jack Miller and Franco Morbidelli braked in front of him. So he just took the outside and swept past both of them into the first corner. Your first corner in a Premier class in your first lights-out race, and all of a sudden he is right behind Pecco Bagnaia and Marc Marquez ahead of him. Unbelievable start, but it was as if he started the way he meant to go on. Finished 5th on an Aprilia in his very first Grand Prix, the first non-Ducati across the line.
Yeah.
Best debut, stat corner for you,
Yes.
best debut by anyone in MotoGP in a race since Marc Marquez finished 3rd in 2013 in Qatar. So it does show you the level that this guy has got in him. Reigning Moto2 champion, I think people thought that he would be decent in MotoGP.
Yeah.
The fact he didn't come in on a Honda was interesting, but he's come in for Aprilia. We know Aprilia doesn't have Jorge Martin at the moment to see the limit of that bike, but as first impressions go, it was a pretty good one.
Yeah, well, it feels like a lot of the stuff we were saying about Pedro Acosta around this time last year as well.
But even his debut wasn't as good as that.
Yes, remarkable, isn't it? Remarkable. Very good. I enjoy it. 2 good overtakes. There'll be so many more this weekend, considering how much motorsport we've got.
Oh, yeah.
Let's look ahead now, Matt, because we've got quite a few big weeks of motorsport coming up for us. I thought we'd have a look. We need a prop, a crystal ball. Something we can have here maybe in future. Just
Virtual
imagine it for
crystal ball.
now.
Yes.
If you're not watching it, just imagine we do actually have it. You don't know any better, but you can watch it if you don't know on YouTube. By Complete Home Filtration, the Complete Home Filtration Crystal Ball. What's your big prediction for the next couple of weeks in motorsport?
Am I going first?
You go first.
Given what we've got coming up in MotoGP, we've got Argentina. Doesn't get used for 51 weeks of the year. Dirty, bit of a goat track, very, very, very slippery. That sounds a bit like a Marc Marquez track, doesn't it?
Oh, imagine.
Turn up straight out of the box and be the guy to indulge in a bit of tarmac motocrossing and be very, very good there.
Yeah.
Following Argentina, we go to the Circuit of the Americas in Texas. Marc Marquez is known as the King of COTA. So my big prediction is that we will get through the first 3 rounds of the MotoGP season and Marquez will be undefeated. He'll win the sprint in Argentina and the Grand Prix and do likewise at COTA.
Yes, but will he eat hamburger afterwards?
He will eat many hamburger.
All right, my prediction. So look, I think it's actually could happen. Could be reasonable. Although yours, I think, probably will happen. So these are good predictions.
Do I need to touch something wooden here?
No, I don't think there's anything wooden in here. I think this is a weekend. Australia finally gets an Australian on the podium at the Australian Grand Prix.
I'm so glad you've gone here.
Could be the top step. I think Oscar Piastri could be the one to do it. You know, we've had, obviously, Daniel Ricciardo had his chances, but obviously never coincided perfectly with the car being in its top form at Albert Park, and then he was disqualified the one time. McLaren does feel like it's going to be the favourite coming into this weekend. Asterisk, very different track to Bahrain, etc., etc. But this feels like our best shot. This genuinely feels like the best shot, and I think it's going to be at least a podium, surely.
4 times an Australian has finished 4th at the Australian Grand Prix. There's a synergy there. Can we just put that in the bin? We've come super, super close.
Yeah.
This has to be the year given McLaren's pre-season favouritism. So no pressure, Oscar. Our country expects.
Yes, very much so. Well, we'll catch up with how Oscar did next week, because that's all the time we've got for Pit Talk today. You can subscribe to Pit Talk wherever you get your podcasts. You can also watch it on YouTube, and you can keep up to date with the latest Formula One, Supercars, MotoGP. It's all happening this weekend at foxsports.com.au. Until next week, I've been Michael Laminato on behalf of Matt. I'll see you next week.